I have been called many things in my life. The cold Duke, the Iron Lord of Caromere, the man no sane woman would marry voluntarily and no wise man would cross twice. None of these names troubled me. I wore them the way I wore my tailcoat, as a suit of armor made of cloth, and equally effective at keeping the world at its proper distance. What I was not called until the autumn of my 39th year was a fool. That oversight was corrected in full by the time Christmas came, and I say this not as complaint. I say it as the most honest thing I know, that the correction was the making of me. Let me begin where it actually begins, which is not with the woman but with the letter. October the 2nd. A pale Tuesday morning, with a frost already setting on the moor, and the rooks rising in their usual sullen formations from the elm avenue, dark shapes against a sky the color of old pewter. My secretary Halworth brought the letter on a salver at 7 o'clock, which meant he considered it worth my attention before I had fortified myself with coffee. I looked at it. The seal was Lord Vane's, a man I had tolerated through 2 decades of parliamentary sessions and one regrettable shooting party in the Yorkshire Dales. A man of small cleverness and enormous self-regard who had the particular social gift of never recognizing when he was unwanted. The letter informed me, in the elaborate circumlocutions Lord Vane favored, that the matter of his son's outstanding debts, some £1,100, the residue of young Cornelius Vane's brief and catastrophically unsuccessful career as a venture speculator in Northern Railway schemes, had not yet been settled to anyone's satisfaction, and that his lordship proposed to resolve it by a means he trusted would be mutually agreeable. His daughter-in-law, he wrote, was a woman of considerable education and organizational capacity. She was, regrettably, at something of a loose end. The Caromere Library and Correspondence Archive, he understood, were in something of a state of disorder. He proposed a season's arrangement. Mrs. Vane would come to Caromere as a paid social secretary. The debt would be extinguished at season's end. Clean, simple, tidy. I read it twice. Then I set it down and sat for a moment looking at the frost advancing across the upper moors, at the pale sky, at the particular desolation of an October morning in the north that most people find oppressive and that I have always found frankly honest. The moor does not pretend. It is cold because it is cold. I have always respected this in a landscape. What I was thinking about, as I looked at the frost, was what kind of man writes a letter like that about a woman who had the misfortune to marry his son. Young Cornelius Vane had been dead for 14 months. His schemes had collapsed around him like rotten scaffolding. His widow had been caught in the wreckage through no agency of her own. The courts had been quite clear on this point, and I knew the case, because it had come before 2 men I knew in the legal profession, and they had told me what it amounted to. A woman who had married in good faith and been left with nothing but her husband's name and his father's cold administrative management of the consequence. And now Lord Vane had found a use for her that was, dressed in the language of professional arrangement, simply a means of parking an inconvenient obligation at someone else's address. I wrote back the same afternoon. The arrangement was acceptable. Mrs. Vane could come at the beginning of the 2nd week of October. The library was, in fact, a disgrace. My uncle had kept it on some organizing principle comprehensible only to himself, and apparently deceased along with him. And I had been refusing to engage with the correspondence backlog for going on 3 years, because it required a kind of patience with the chaotic that I did not possess. Let her come. I did not ask what she was like. This was, as I have said, the beginning of my education in foolishness. I assumed she would be exactly what Lord Vane's letter implied, competent, quiet, grateful for the arrangement, and entirely invisible. I had not survived 39 years of Northern society by underestimating the damage a woman could do in a house, but I had developed habits of emotional economy over the course of those 39 years, and the primary habit was this. The fewer people I allowed to matter, the fewer could disappoint me. It was a system with impeccable logic, and I now know a fatal flaw, which is that it requires you to believe that not mattering to anyone is a satisfactory state of affairs. I had believed this for some years. The belief was, that autumn, about to be tested to destruction. Mrs. Vane arrived on the 12th of October, in the afternoon, in a hired coach that looked as if it had been assembled from the rejected parts of 2 better coaches by someone who had heard of coaches, but not seen one. The afternoon was gray, with a thin rain off the moor that was not quite rain and not quite mist, but something northern and characteristic. I was in the East Wing going over estate accounts with my steward Pemberton and did not go out to receive her, which I now acknowledge was deliberate and not accidental. I told myself the estate accounts were pressing. This was true. The accounts are always pressing in October. I also told myself I owed a woman arriving to discharge a debt no ceremony of welcome. This was, I would discover, the first of several positions I would have to revise thoroughly and with some embarrassment. Pemberton told me at 6 o'clock that Mrs. Vane had been settled in the East Guest Suite, not the finest rooms, which were reserved for when I had family I was obligated to tolerate, but perfectly comfortable rooms with good fires and a view of the walled garden and the moor beyond, and that she had inquired upon arriving whether the Carrowmere Library was east or west of the main staircase. He reported this with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to editorialize about his employer's arrangements. She had not, he added, asked to see me. She had asked to see the library. I found this mildly irritating, which ought to have told me something about who this woman was and what she was going to do to the careful equilibrium of my house. But I attributed it to professional focus and thought no more of it. Dinner that first evening was in the small dining room because I saw no reason to open the great hall for one woman of uncertain social standing. I arrived at 7, took my seat at the head of the table with the customary silence of a man who has eaten alone long enough to have made a ceremony of it, and looked, for the first time, at Mrs. Rosalind Vane. She was younger than I had expected. I had somehow imagined Lord Vane's letter implied a woman of middle years, capable and gray-templed, and requiring no particular attention. This woman was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair arranged with the economical neatness of someone who owns a small number of hairpins and uses each of them deliberately. Her gown was well cut, but had been turned and altered, the seams betrayed it, to anyone who looked, and was a shade of slate blue that was either the current fashion for half-mourning or simply the color she had remaining. Her face was what I would have called, in those days before I learned her face well, quietly handsome. Not the fashionable beauty that northern drawing rooms preferred, which ran to elaborate prettiness and a great deal of white skin displayed to advantage, but something more considered and more fine, with a quality of attention in it, as if the face were permanently engaged in the business of thinking clearly. Her eyes, when she looked up from her soup, were the deep gray of the upper moors in November, and they were completely direct. She looked at me the way you look at the problem you have been given, not the way you look at the person you are required to impress. She did not appear nervous. This struck me immediately. Most people who came to dine at Carrowmere for the first time were at least visibly aware that they were guests in a house belonging to the cold Duke of the North, a man whose temper was regarded locally as something between a weather system and a geological feature, immovable, unpredictable on a small scale, and broadly cold. She appeared to be thinking about something entirely unrelated to my consequence or my temper. I asked, because I ask every guest the opening question that requires the least follow-up, whether the journey had been tolerable. She said the road north of Kirby was in poor repair, and she understood from various sources that it had been in poor repair for some years. And was the matter of road maintenance a county question, or did it fall to estate holders in the affected parishes to petition individually for improvement? I looked at her for a moment over the rim of my wine glass. This was not what guests said at dinner on their first evening. Guests said on their first evening that the journey had been fatiguing, but the North was always so bracing at this time of year, or words to that effect. They said things that required no actual answer and revealed nothing about whether anyone inside them was actually thinking. A county question, I said, though the county has been persuaded to ignore it for rather longer than is reasonable. The road funds are regularly redirected to the bridges near Harton, where the Earl of Harton sits on the roads committee and has sat on it, to everyone's inconvenience, for the better part of 2 decades. Ah, she said, that does explain it. And a very small but genuine look of satisfaction crossed her face, the look of someone who has found the answer to a question that had been nagging at them. Then she returned to her soup. I found myself, against my will and my considered habit, faintly amused. The meal progressed with a quality of conversation that I had not conducted at my own table in some years, which is to say, an actual conversation, not the performance of conversation that passes between people of rank at formal dinners, where everything said is designed to imply something about consequence, and nothing is designed to convey anything of actual interest. She asked, without any particular ceremony, about the library. I told her what I knew of it, which was principally that my uncle had organized it by some system involving colored ribbons on the shelf edges, the significance of which had entirely disintegrated along with the ribbons, and that the cataloging had not been touched in 40 years. The late Duke had a catalog of his own invention, I said. He shared it with no one during his lifetime. When he died, the knowledge of how it worked died with him. So the knowledge of what you have is buried in the collection itself, she said. Precisely, which makes it rather less useful than one would hope in a working library. That's rather a satisfying problem, she said. I set down my fork. The dining room was quiet except for the fire and the rain against the long windows. You find it satisfying. It is like a map that can only be read from the inside, she said, with the patient pleasure of someone explaining something they have already thought through clearly. Most libraries are organized from the outside. You know what you have and you retrieve it. This one requires you to discover what you have by finding it. Which means by the time the catalog is complete, whoever completes it will have read everything in it. She said this last not with the theatrical satisfaction of performance, but with the quiet pleasure of someone who has spotted a particularly good walk on the horizon and is already in her mind beginning it. Not performing delight, simply experiencing it. This was the third mildly irritating thing she had done in 20 minutes, and none of the three were things she had done wrong. After dinner, I went to my study and sat for a while looking at my fire. Then I went to bed and dreamed about nothing, which is what I always dream about, and told myself in the morning that the arrangement was proceeding precisely as expected. It was not proceeding as expected. By the end of the second week, I knew three things I had not known on the 12th of October. The first was that the Caromere Library contained, in addition to the predictable vast runs of legal reports, parliamentary proceedings, and estate surveys, a quite extraordinary collection of Greek and Latin texts assembled by the third Duke, who had apparently been a serious classical scholar of the first order, and had spent 20 years acquiring first editions and rare manuscripts in a way I had never fully registered as significant. I had known the collection was there. I had not known what it was. The second was that Mrs. Vane could read it. Not in the halting way that fashionable young women are sometimes taught a few decorative lines of Latin, and displayed at dinner as an accomplishment alongside the piano. In the way a person reads a language they have known for years, with the ease of familiarity, the eye moving across the page with the confidence of long practice. The third was that she had begun, entirely without instruction from me, and with nothing more than the tacit permission of being left to do her work, to cross-reference the collection against a handwritten list she had assembled from the scattered accession notes she could find, building the invisible map of the library from the inside, exactly as she had described. I discovered all of this on the morning of the 25th of October, when I walked into the library at 9 o'clock, intending to retrieve a copy of Blackstone's commentaries, and found Mrs. Vane at the far end of the room, standing on the second step of the library ladder with a large folio open across her arms, reading with the absorbed stillness of a woman who has entirely forgotten that there is anyone else in the world. She was reading aloud very quietly to herself in Greek. I stood in the doorway for considerably longer than strictly necessary. The library was warm. She had ordered the fire built up early, which Mrs. Pemberton had done without question, and the light was the pale northern morning light that comes through the long windows in October at an angle that turns everything golden for a period of about 40 minutes before going gray again. She stood in this light on the second step of the ladder with the folio balanced across her forearms and her face entirely given over to the text, and I had the distinct experience of watching someone who was, in that moment, entirely happy, not performing happiness, simply in it. Then I cleared my throat. She looked up. Her expression shifted from that distance to the precise, considered courtesy of a woman who remembers abruptly that she is an employee in someone else's house. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not hear you come in." "The Thucydides," I said, because I had looked at what she was holding, and it was simply the first thing I could identify. The History of the Peloponnesian War, 3rd Duke's edition, a handsome folio from a Venetian printer of the previous century. "Yes," she said. "The 3rd Duke's notes in the margin are extraordinary. He was there, you know, the Grand Tour, 1748, and he has annotated half a dozen passages on the Sicilian expedition by reference to the actual terrain. He had been to Syracuse, apparently, and walked the ground. She descended the ladder and held the folio toward me, open to a page dense with that cramped 18th century hand in the margins. And this was the thing I could not entirely explain then or now. She held it toward me not as an employee displaying a valuable object to its owner, careful to demonstrate professional competence, but with the unguarded pleasure of someone sharing a discovery with another person who might also appreciate it. As if it had not occurred to her to be strategic about it. As if my appreciation, or lack of it, was a simple question to which she genuinely wanted the answer. I looked at the annotations. They were, as she had said, extraordinary, precise, geographically detailed, the observations of a man who had stood in the places Thucydides described and measured them against his own eyes, his own boots on the ground. Notes in the margin about the width of the river, the angle of the terrain, the distance from the coast. I had owned this book for 39 years and had never opened it past the first pages. I had not known this was in here. "Leave the Greek to Oxford men," I said. It was what I had always been told. It was what every person in the county would have told you about a woman standing on a library ladder reading Greek aloud to herself. It was what the entire machinery of the social world in which I lived would have produced on the question of Mrs. Rosalind Vane and the third Dukes Thucydides. And I said it not with any particular force of conviction, but because it was the available phrase, and I had not yet learned to distrust available phrases. She looked at me, not with offense and not without it entirely. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a man who has said something she has heard so many times it has worn smooth, the way a river stone wears smooth, not sharpened by it anymore, simply shaped, not wounded, simply aware that this is the stone and it is always going to be in the river. "If you prefer," she said, "I will simply catalog the English language holdings separately and leave the classical collection to be dealt with by whoever else you choose to engage." She set the Thucydides down on the reading table with the same care she gave everything. Then she went back to the ladder, selected another volume from the shelf she had been working through, and returned to her work. I took my Blackstone, I walked to my study. I sat at my desk for 20 minutes without reading a word of it, which is not something I have done before or since. And then I did something I had not done since I was a young man setting out on the management of an estate I had unexpectedly inherited and found frightening. I asked myself what it was, exactly, that I actually thought, as distinct from what I had always said. What I actually thought was this: she should not have been told to leave the Greek to Oxford men. She should have been at Oxford, or Oxford should, 30 years ago, have had the sense to find a way to admit people like her and been the better for it. And what I had said was not my position. It was a reflex. It was the available phrase. It was the stone in the river. I did not say this to anyone, but I thought it, in the way you think things that are simply true, quietly and without drama, the way you notice that a window wants reglazing or an account has been added wrong. November came down on Caromere like a lid closing over a box. The moor turned its deep winter bronze, and the light shortened to a mere allowance of 4 hours, and the house settled into the particular stone-and-wood silence of a northern estate in the cold months that I have always found, to be honest, the most natural state for it. In summer, Caromere presents itself beautifully to visitors, all green hills and grand perspective, and the kind of weather that makes even stone houses look welcoming. In winter it is only what it is: old, enormous stone, very quiet and entirely itself. I have always preferred it. Mrs. Vane adapted to it without any apparent difficulty, and within a week looked as if she had never lived anywhere else. She rose early, earlier than I did, which I found out because Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, mentioned in passing that candles were being used in the library before 6 in the morning, and she had taken the liberty of ordering the fire in that room built earlier than was usual. She worked through the mornings with a systematic patience that reminded me, when I allowed myself to think about it, of the way I approach estate accounts in a difficult year. The pleasure of bringing order to a thing that has been disordered, not for any single grand end, but for the satisfaction of each small problem understood and resolved. The correspondence she dealt with in the afternoons, clearing the backlog with a speed and discretion that Halworth remarked on twice and found clearly uncomfortable, since it implied he had been managing it less well. By the middle of November, the 3-year-old arrears of correspondence were cleared. The current letters were dealt with the same day they arrived. and she had begun to devise, without being asked, a filing system for the estate records that was organized by both date and subject, cross-referenced in a way that meant you could find what you wanted from either direction. I found this the third week of November and spent an hour simply looking at it, because it was the system I had always wanted and had never managed to describe clearly enough that anyone else could build it. I mentioned this to her at dinner. I said, choosing my words carefully, that the filing system was exceptionally well considered. She said, the old one was organized only by date, which means you can only find what you knew you were looking for. This one assumes you might also need to find everything that touched a particular subject across different years. Estate accounts do that, an issue with a tenant family, or a long dispute about a boundary, or a water rights question. These run across many years, and you need to see the whole thread, not just a single year. Yes, I said, precisely that. I thought you probably looked for things that way, she said, and then she helped herself to more of the rabbit and said nothing more about it. I thought about this later, lying in my dark room with the moor wind doing its usual work on the north face of the house. She had thought about how I used the records. She had built the system for how I think, not how records are conventionally organized. This was a different thing from being capable. Capable people build systems that work. She had built a system that worked for this specific person in this specific house, without being asked, without comment, without expecting the observation to be made. In the evenings she dined, and we talked. The talking was the thing I had not predicted and could not prevent. I had eaten alone at Caromere for 6 years. The occasional guest was no exception to the essential rule of solitude. I had, over those 6 years, reduced the frequency and duration of visits from family and neighbors to the bare minimum that decency required, partly because I found most people exhausting, and partly because I had learned that the most efficient way to be thought antisocial was to be, in fact, antisocial, which saved a great deal of trouble. The house reflected me. Silence was its natural state. Mrs. Vane did not fill the silence the way most people fill silence, which is to say with noise designed to conceal discomfort. She spoke when she had something to say. When she did not have something to say, she ate her dinner with the same composed attention she brought to the Thucydides, and did not seem to find the quiet between sentences embarrassing. This was, I discovered over those first November weeks, profoundly restful. After 6 years of either real solitude or the performance of social ease, the experience of eating dinner with someone who was simply present, without anxiety about my consequence or eagerness to impress me or any social ambition that required navigating. This was something I had not known I was missing, which is the worst kind of missing. On the 3rd of November, she told me, without particular drama, that she had found what appeared to be an unpublished treatise by the 3rd Duke on the relationship between Thucydides' account of the Sicilian expedition and the tactical failures of the Marlborough campaigns, including specific criticism of the Duke of Marlborough's supply arrangements at Malplaquet that were quite scorching in their directness. She had found it bound in with what appeared from the outside to be estate surveys from 1751. I put down my soup spoon. Bound in with the estate surveys. I think the 3rd Duke may have hidden it there deliberately, she said. His eldest son, your great-grandfather, disagreed with him about almost everything, and the library was the 3rd Duke's domain and his retreat. I believe the 4th Duke may never have read the estate surveys of 1751 particularly carefully. The relevant entries were quite dull, apparently, and the 3rd Duke may have known this, a hiding place in plain sight. There was a silence. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked through the quiet. You are telling me, I said, that my library contains a hidden scholarly manuscript about Thucydides and Marlborough. Yes, also possibly some letters. There are several packets of correspondence in what presents itself as the survey section from 1748 to 1756 that seem, from what I can read of the seals and the exterior hands, to be personal in nature rather than a state business. I have not opened them. Why not? She considered this for a moment with the directness she brought to everything, considering things properly before she answered them. They are not mine to open without permission. They may be significant to the estate, in which case you should know what they contain, or they may be entirely private, in which case you should still know, but the decision about what is done with them should be yours. I looked at her across the dinner table. Open them, I said. If they are private in a way that seems to require discretion, use your judgment. She nodded, nothing more. This was another thing I had learned. She did not elaborate what did not require elaboration. She did not seek approval beyond what was needed. She simply noted the answer and moved on. After dinner, when she had gone up to her rooms, I walked to the library. I stood in the empty room with its smell of old leather and tallow and candle smoke, and the cold coming through the long windows, and looked at the shelves, which were still in the early stages of the reorganization she was building, but were already beginning to show the outline of a real order emerging from the previous chaos. The deteriorated colored ribbons gone, replaced with her careful pencil labels on small cards, the accession notes she had found gathered and pinned carefully in the relevant areas. The working catalog growing steadily in a dark blue ledger on the reading table. I pulled out the ledger and looked at it. The handwriting was small and precise, moving from Latin to English without hesitation, cross-referencing by date, provenance, and subject simultaneously, noting physical condition and legibility, flagging items of particular significance with a small asterisk and a brief comment. It was not the work of a woman making a professional display of competence to a difficult employer. It was the work of a woman who genuinely cared about what she was doing, who had found, in my disordered library, the same thing I had always found in a disordered account book, the satisfaction of understanding a thing completely. I set the ledger down. I stood for a while in the quiet library with the fire burning low and the moor invisible beyond the dark windows. Then I went to bed and told myself, with the firmness of a man who knows exactly what he is telling himself, that this was a professional arrangement. A tidily constructed professional arrangement. She was here to discharge a debt, and she would leave in the spring, and I would have a catalogued library and a cleared archive, and she would have her freedom from Lord Vane's terms, and this was entirely sensible. There was nothing else. There was no reason for anything else. I was quite convinced of this. The conviction lasted until the 9th of November, when she came into my study after dinner. The first time she had ever come to the study, an action that required some initiative, since the study was clearly my private domain, and set a folder of papers on my desk and said very quietly, "I think you should see these." The letters from the estate surveys of 1751 to 1756 were not estate surveys. They were 37 letters between the 3rd Duke of Caromere and a woman named Eliza, who was, by the evidence of the letters, the daughter of a Sheffield ironmaster, and entirely ineligible by every social measure the 3rd Duke's world could name or apply. They had been in love. The letters made this full and clear and specific, with the specificity of people who write to each other knowing they may not speak, who put into written words what they cannot say in rooms with other people present. 9 years. They had not married. Eliza had married someone appropriate to her station and her father's ambitions, a respectable merchant from Leeds. The 3rd Duke had never spoken of her. The letters had been hidden in estate surveys for 140 years. And no one had read them until a woman who had been brought to Caromere to discharge a debt opened them at my dinner table and found, inside the 1751 surveys, a man who had spent 9 years loving someone he was not permitted to love. I read them that evening after Mrs. Vane had gone up. The fire burned low, and I did not stir it. Outside, the north wind came off the moor and went around the corners of the house in the way it always does, the house's own particular voice in the dark. The 3rd Duke had been a careful man. He had been a good man, by all the accounts that had reached me, careful with his tenants, honest in his dealings, devoted to his scholarship. He had done everything the world required of him. He had been the 3rd Duke of Caromere, and he had been that completely, and he had hidden 37 letters in the estate surveys and died with the other life entirely private. When I finally went to bed, something had shifted in me that I could not entirely account for, and I chose, with deliberate discipline, not to try to account for it yet. What I did instead was begin to find reasons to be in the library. This is not something I could have said aloud. It would have sounded exactly as foolish as it was. But from the 10th of November forward, my morning's work in the study somehow frequently resolved to a need for a particular reference text that lived in the library, or a question about the correspondence archive that required my direct oversight, or simply, I confess this now, in the retrospect, I have been promising myself for years, a desire to be in a room where she was. Where someone was thinking carefully about serious things with the quiet pleasure of real engagement, and the fire was warm and built up properly, and the smell of old books and candle smoke was thick in the air, and the silence between two people was the comfortable kind that does not require filling. She was always at the library table or on the ladder or working along the shelves. She always looked up when I came in. She always said good morning without ceremony or performance. She never treated my presence as unusual, which I understood to mean that she noticed it and chose not to remark upon it, and this was a quality of kindness, a practical, unsentimental kindness, that I found I could not entirely categorize. We argued about Thucydides on the 15th of November. It was not a heated argument. It was the kind of argument that happens between two people who have thought carefully about the same material and arrived at genuinely different positions, and who do not require either position to yield for the sake of social ease. I had been reading the third Duke's treatise in the evenings, working through it steadily. It was remarkable work, tightly reasoned and provocative, and it had sent me back to Thucydides himself for the first time in years. I had come to a position about Thucydides' account of niches at the Asinaris River that Mrs. Vane disagreed with when I raised it over the soup. Niches was not simply a coward, she said. He was a man caught between what the omens permitted him to do and what the military situation required him to do. If you read the passages Thucydides quotes alongside the third Duke's note on the actual position of the Athenian camp at the Asinaris, you see that Niches was working with information that Thucydides only had in retrospect. He didn't know what we know. He was deciding under conditions of real uncertainty. That is precisely the argument for cowardice, I said. He chose the comfort of the omen over the necessity of action at the moment when action was still possible. The eclipse had provided enough delay. He had the time to move. He chose not to. He chose a framework he had lived inside his entire life, she said. The omens were not superstition to him. They were the structure by which the world operated. The question is whether we can fault a man for being fully formed by the world that made him, when the world that made him gave him nothing else to work with. There was a silence. Outside, it had begun to snow, the first real snow of November, coming down through the gray afternoon light in the deliberate way of northern snow that has decided to stay. Can we not fault him? I said slowly, feeling my way through it the way I had not felt my way through an argument in years, genuinely, not rhetorically, and still say that the choice was wrong, that the two things coexist. He was formed entirely by what made him, and he still chose wrong, and both are true. She considered this carefully. Yes, she said, I think that is true. The formation explains the choice without excusing it. They are not the same thing. I thought about the third Duke, about 37 letters in a folder hidden in estate surveys, about a man who had been formed entirely by what made him and had made the choice that the world required of him, which had been, for 37 letters and 9 years, the wrong one. About Eliza, the ironmaster's daughter from Sheffield, who had also been fully formed by the world that made her and had also made the choice it required, and had gone to Leeds and lived her life, and perhaps never known that across the county there was a man who was keeping her letters in the estate surveys. I think I agree with you, I said. She did not treat this as a victory. She went back to the catalogue on the reading table, and I stood in the snow-quiet room for a moment, watching the first real snowfall of the year come down through the gray afternoon outside the long windows, before I too went back to what I was supposed to be doing. I walked back to my study and sat at my desk for some time not working. I thought about the formation argument, about being shaped by what made you and choosing within those constraints and the difference between that, the explanation, and the rightness of the choice. She had made the distinction cleanly. The two things coexist. You can be entirely a product of your formation and still have chosen wrong. The formation does not excuse the choice. It only explains it. I was aware that I was no longer thinking about niches. Pemberton came to me on the 20th of November with the careful expression he wore when he had information of a socially delicate nature to convey. He told me that letters had arrived from Lady Hargreave of the neighboring estate and from the Countess of Wendellmore, both requesting information about the arrangement at Carrowmere. He conveyed this factually and with no editorializing, which was what I paid him to do and what I appreciated about him. The inference was quite clear. A young widow, daughter-in-law of Lord Vane, who was known throughout the county both for his self-importance and for the spectacular collapse of his son's ventures, was living at Carrowmere in what was described as a professional arrangement. The northern county was going to have views on this. The northern county always had views. It was the county's primary occupation in the winter months, when there was nothing to do outdoors. I wrote back to Lady Hargreave and the Countess of Wendellmore with the brief, courteous correspondence style I had spent 39 years perfecting. The arrangement at Caromere was a professional one of a standard nature, concerned with library cataloging and archive management. I trusted this sufficiently addressed their inquiries. I said it without warmth and without particular coldness. I did not say anything more than this because I was not yet in a position to say anything more, and I was honest enough with myself, barely, but sufficiently, to recognize that this was the case. But I sat with the letters for some time before I sent them. Looking at them, considering what it was that I was, precisely, protecting with this brisk professional description. What I knew by the 20th of November was this. I had lived at Caromere for 6 years in a deliberate, and I had believed, entirely adequate solitude. I had built the solitude carefully after my father's death, after a long and draining period of estate disputes and family obligations, and a brief, thoroughly disastrous near engagement to a woman of appropriate rank who had found, quite correctly, that I was not capable of making her happy. I had retreated to what I was actually good at, running the estate, managing the accounts, keeping my own company, reading my books in my quiet library. The cold was something I had chosen. I had told myself it was sufficient. I had believed this, with the conviction of a man who has not had his belief tested. Mrs. Vane's presence in my house had not challenged this belief directly. She had done none of the things that people usually do that I find impossible to tolerate, had not flattered me or navigated toward my good opinion or performed warmth or interest. She had simply been here, serious and composed and capable and entirely herself, as if it had never occurred to her to be anything else. And I had discovered, at 39, with the distinct discomfort of a discovery made too late to be comfortable, that I had been profoundly lonely. This is not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. It is considerably less comfortable than finding an unpublished manuscript in the estate surveys. It required acknowledging that the cold I had cultivated so carefully was not sufficiency, but avoidance, and that 6 years of avoidance is a long time, and that I had not known this because I had had nothing to compare it to. I compared it now. I had something to compare it to. I did not act on the comparison. This is important to say. I am not the sort of man who acts impulsively on a realization made in a cold study in November. I am emphatically not that kind of man. I sat with it and continued my mornings in the accounts and my afternoons with Pemberton and my evenings in the library where she was, and I allowed the thing to be true without doing anything with it yet. December arrived. The snow settled on the moor in earnest, and the great avenue of elms stood in their winter silhouettes against a sky that was pale and specific to this latitude and this season, a color I had always known and never named. The house was fuller than it had been since I had inherited it, not because I had invited anyone beyond the normal December gathering, but because December at Caromere traditionally meant exactly that, a gathering. A week before Christmas, in which the county's significant families visited, ate the dinners Mrs. Pemberton produced with extraordinary calm from a kitchen that I continued to regard as one of the true wonders of the North, attended the estate church for the Sunday service, and conducted the social business of a northern winter in each other's presence. It had been a tradition in this family for 4 generations. I had reduced it over 6 years from a week to a long weekend, and kept the guest list to the essential minimum, and conducted it with the efficiency of a man who considers the whole thing a perfectly reasonable duty and nothing more. This year's gathering was the 6th to the 9th of December. I had invited, among others, the Countess of Wendellmore and Lady Hargreave, because to not invite them would have raised questions that I preferred to answer on my own terms. I told Mrs. Vane about the gathering on the 1st of December. I told her she was welcome to take her meals in her rooms during the period if she found it preferable, or to dine with the household, as she had been doing if she preferred. I said it with the brisk professional courtesy I had been using for every matter between us, and I watched her face as I said it. She said, without any alteration of expression, she would take her meals in her rooms, as she understood that to be the more appropriate arrangement. "There is no arrangement that requires it," I said. "The choice is yours." "There is an expectation that requires it," she said. "Your guests will know what I am and how I come to be here. It would be simpler for everyone if I stayed out of the way." She said this without self-pity or bitterness. She said it as a woman states a fact about the room she is in, not resentfully, simply accurately. She was naming the situation as it was, with the same clarity she brought to everything. "As you wish," I said. "I regretted it before I had left the library. I regretted it while I was walking down the corridor. I regretted it at dinner and again, when I went to bed, and again at 6 the next morning when I lay in the dark listening to the wind on the moor and knowing, with the particular clarity of 6 o'clock in December, that I had just allowed the situation to require something of her that I should not have allowed it to require, because I was not yet ready to say what I needed to say to make it different." The gathering arrived on the 6th with its usual cold-weather energy, carriages crunching on the gravel, luggage in the hall, the noise of families that spend most of the year carefully maintaining their social distances, suddenly compressed under one roof with the particular social electricity this always produces. I performed the role of host with the economy that years of practice had given me. I spoke to everyone the necessary amount. I sat at the head of the dinner table for 2 evenings and directed conversation with the minimal direct engagement that somehow always creates the impression of graciousness, which is one of those effects I have never entirely understood but have always been able to produce. The Countess of Wendellmore arrived on the evening of the 6th, on the same carriage as her husband and Lady Hargreave, which I had not anticipated and did not particularly welcome. The Countess was a woman of 60 with the precise observational habits of a woman who has spent 4 decades understanding exactly where power lives in a room and directing herself toward it with the practiced confidence of long expertise. She was entirely charming, and she was entirely dangerous, and I had always preferred her in my line of sight to lurking in my peripheral vision. On the evening of the 7th, she asked me, between the fish course and the meat, whether I found the arrangement with Mrs. Vane satisfactory. She said it with the exact pitch of voice that conveys, "This question is not about the arrangement." "Quite satisfactory," I said. "The library is in considerably better order than it has been in 40 years. The correspondence archive has been cleared. The third Duke's classical collection, which I had not fully understood I possessed, has been catalogued to a standard that is, I understand from the evidence, quite exceptional. There is also an unpublished scholarly treatise that will be of considerable interest to the historical societies." "Exceptional," the Countess repeated, tasting the word. "A great deal of exceptional quality from an indenture arrangement." "Mrs. Vane is exceptionally capable," I said. "Lord Vane has been in this at least accurate in his description." There was a fractional pause. Lady Hargreave, who was listening with the attentiveness of someone who intends to remember everything and use it later, refreshed her wine. "How very fortunate for you," said the Countess. "Though I confess I should have thought the situation, a widow of the Vane connection in residence at Carrowmere, might have benefited from a somewhat less prominent arrangement. These things are noticed, you understand. The county notices. It would seem to me that for the sake of propriety." "I recommend the venison," I said. "Mrs. Pemberton has been particularly attentive to the marinade this year, and I think you will find it is worth your attention." The Countess received this with the exact grace of a woman who has been stopped mid-sentence and is filing the interruption away for later use. The topic was closed for the evening, but I sat through the rest of dinner quite aware that she was not done, and that the morning would bring whatever she had decided to do with it. I was right about the morning. On the morning of the 8th I came down at 7, earlier than I usually appeared during the gathering, because I had not slept particularly well, for reasons I was not examining, and came into the main hall just as Mrs. Vane was coming down the main staircase on her way to the library. She had taken all her meals in her room, as she had said. The library was her domain regardless. She had her work. She had not heard me come into the hall below. She was a few steps from the bottom of the staircase, and her attention was on the leather-bound volume she was carrying, a text I recognized from the binding as one of the third Duke's Greek editions. The Countess of Wendellmore came out of the morning room with her coffee cup in hand and looked up the staircase, and I watched the expression on her face as she assembled her decision. She had composed the sentence overnight. I could see this. It had the quality of a prepared remark delivered to appear spontaneous. "Ah, Mrs. Vane," she said, in that carrying register. "How convenient that you are still in residence. I had understood the arrangement was a seasonal one. One does wonder how these things are managed when the season extends so very far past its natural conclusion." Mrs. Vane stopped, 3 steps from the bottom. She looked at the Countess with those gray eyes, and there was a pause in which I watched her absorb the remark, not the way someone absorbs a blow, flinching, but the way someone absorbs something they have absorbed many times and knows the shape of. Not wounded by it, simply knowing it. "The library work takes somewhat longer than originally estimated," she said, with a composure that I found, even from where I was standing, genuinely remarkable. "The collection is considerably more significant than was initially known." "I'm quite sure it is," said the Countess, with a smile that was a small, perfectly crafted object. "And I'm entirely sure the Duke is very grateful for your thoroughness. We are all, I'm sure, grateful for the dedication with which you have applied yourself to his collection." The word was chosen to land in a particular way. It landed. I could see that it landed. And I watched Mrs. Vane stand on the staircase with her book and take the weight of it and not move, and something in me went entirely cold in the way I go cold when a line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. I walked out of the study doorway into the hall. The Countess did not know I was there. She had her back to the study. The shift in the room when I entered it was the shift you feel when a person walks in who changes the weight of the space. I am aware this is how I enter rooms. I have always been aware of it. I learned early that it was a tool that could be used, and I learned to use it deliberately. Now I used it without thinking at all. I walked to the foot of the staircase. I did not look at the Countess. I looked at Mrs. Vane, who had seen me come in and whose expression had shifted to something very still. "Lady Wendell, I said. My voice was entirely level. I was not aware we had reached the point in the morning at which my guests are in the habit of addressing the members of my household from the morning room doorway." The Countess said something smooth about merely passing the time of morning in a friendly manner. "Quite," I said. I looked at Mrs. Vane. "I had hoped to speak with you before you began this morning's work if you have a moment." She came down the remaining 3 steps. "Of course, Your Grace." We walked to the study. I closed the door, and I stood with my hand on the door for a moment and thought very carefully about what I was going to say, not whether to say it. I was beyond the question of whether, but how exactly to say it so that she understood what I meant and had no room to misunderstand. I turned around. She was standing in the center of the room with that composed, contained expression. The one I had spent 2 months learning was not the blankness I had first taken it for, but containment. The expression of a woman who has learned to keep everything she feels in a very carefully controlled space until she is certain it is safe to let it be larger. "The arrangement," I said, "is not what I wish it to be." She waited. "I mean the terms," I said. "The arrangement as Lord Vane constructed it and as I accepted it." "The terms are clear," she began. "I know the terms are clear. I wrote the letter accepting them. I am telling you that I accepted them without thinking carefully about what they meant, and I should have thought more carefully, and I am asking you to allow me to correct this." A silence. She was looking at me with that direct gray gaze, and I could see her trying to understand what I was saying. "The debt," I said, "will be extinguished this morning. I intend to write to Lord Vane today and settle it entirely, regardless of anything else. That is not a negotiation. That is simply what should have been done differently at the beginning." "That is," she stopped, started again. "That is very generous." "It is not generosity," I said. "It is the correction of something I should not have agreed to in the form I agreed to it. A woman of your quality should not be arriving at anyone's house with a debt to discharge. That is not a suitable arrangement, and I allowed it, and I am ending it." She was very still. "The separate question," I said, "is whether you have any inclination at all, toward a different arrangement. A different reason for being at Caromere." I stopped. I was 39 years old. I had spent the better part of 20 years constructing a careful architecture of coldness and distance, and here I stood in my own study at 7 in the morning with the north wind off the moor and a house full of guests, and the Countess of Wendell approximately 40 feet away through a solid oak door, and I was about to say the thing I had not said to anyone. "I am asking," I said, "whether you have any inclination toward remaining here not as an employee, but as the woman I would like very much to ask to marry me. If she is willing, which she may not be, and which I will entirely understand if she is not." The room was very quiet. She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I had time to become aware of the clock on the mantelpiece, and the fire and the particular quality of the morning light through the study windows, gray and December soft. The debt, she said at last, would be extinguished regardless. You have said so. Yes, entirely regardless. Then I am not, she took a breath. I am not being asked as part of an arrangement. The question is genuinely separate. Entirely separate. I want this to be completely clear. Another silence. Long enough that I became very aware of the quality of it, not empty, but full of something she was working through, carefully, in the way she worked through everything. You have known me for 7 weeks, she said. I have, I said. In 7 weeks I discovered that I had been lonely for 6 years without knowing it. I found that this house is different when you are in it. I found that I would rather argue with you about Thucydides than sit in accomplished silence with anyone else I have known. I stopped for a moment. I found the third Duke's letters. Her expression changed. Something opened in it, the containment giving way for a moment, the thing she had been holding back becoming briefly visible. Something that made her look younger and less careful and entirely herself. He never told her, she said softly. He hid the letters in the estate surveys and he lived his entire life and he never told her. He never told her, I said. He chose what the world required of him. He was, as you said, formed entirely by what made him, and he made the choice that formation allowed. I find that I am not willing to make the same choice, whatever it costs the county. The snow came down outside the study windows on the gray December morning. The clock ticked. Somewhere in the house, someone's voice ran briefly along a corridor and was gone. She said at last, I am not at all certain that I am what your county expects of you. My county, I said, can find a different duke if it requires one with more conventional expectations. I have been entirely clear with my county about any number of things over the years, and it adjusts. Eventually. The smallest thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The absolute possibility of one held very still. I should like to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need. She thought through that morning. I attended to my guests with the extraordinary focused composure of a man whose entire interior world was conducting itself at a pitch that made the ordinary business of social conversation feel very distant and very thin. The Countess of Wendellmore sat beside me at luncheon and said something about the County Agricultural Committee, and I answered her correctly with the names and positions she was expecting. Lady Hargreave asked about the Christmas church arrangements, and I told her. All of this was as normal as breathing. None of it touched what was happening in the other room from wherever I was, where a woman was deciding whether she wanted to stay. She came to the library at 2 o'clock. I was there. I had given up any pretense of estate accounts, and had simply sat in the library with the Blackstone I had been meaning to read for 2 months, reading it properly at last in the quiet afternoon. I heard her footstep on the corridor before she came in. I had learned the footstep. She stood in the doorway with her hands still at her sides, and her expression direct and composed and entirely her own, and warm. Warmer than I had seen it before, the thing she had been holding back given a little more room. Yes, she said, I am willing. I set down the Blackstone. I stood up. I crossed the library, which is a long room, and I was aware of crossing it quickly, and I took her hands in both of mine, and I said, very quietly, so it was only for her, Thank you. She looked up at me. The gray eyes were warm in a way I had not seen before, as if the thing she had been containing had been given permission to be larger than the space she had kept it in. Don't thank me yet, she said. You haven't told the Countess. I was going to do that at dinner, I said. Of course you were, she said. And the corner of her mouth did what it had done that morning, and this time the smile completed itself, and I saw for the first time what she looked like when she was not containing anything. I thought, yes, there it is. I should have been in less of a hurry to be cold. The dinner on the evening of the 8th of December arranged itself around a single moment. I had escorted Mrs. Vane into the dining room. She had not taken her meals with the household during the gathering, but she was here now, and she walked into the room with the composed directness that was simply hers, that she brought to everything, that was not performance and not armor, but simply who she was. And I had taken my seat at the head of the table with her beside me. The Countess of Wendellmore looked at this arrangement with the expression of a woman who is very quickly revising her understanding of the state of affairs at Carrowmere. Lady Hargreave was entirely still. The other guests, 8 of them around the long table, had the collective attentiveness of people who understand they are about to witness something they will be discussing for some time. I said to the table, in the tone of voice I use for facts that do not require discussion. Before we begin, I should tell you that the arrangement under which Mrs. Vane came to Carrowmere has been dissolved as of this morning. The debt in question has been settled entirely. Mrs. Vane has agreed to remain at Carrowmere in a rather different capacity. I intend to write to Lord Vane this week and to make the announcement formally in the new year. But as you are all here and will learn of it in any case, it seemed preferable to tell you directly. The Countess of Wendellmore opened her mouth. "I recommend the soup," I said. "Mrs. Pemberton has been particularly attentive to the broth this year, and I think you will find it worth your attention." The Countess closed her mouth. 3 seconds of silence, the exact duration of silence that precedes a social room realigning itself. And then Lady Hargreave said something gracious about being very pleased for us both. And the man to her left said something to the man beside him. And the soup arrived in the hands of 2 footmen with the excellent timing Mrs. Pemberton always managed to produce. And the table reformed itself around the soup, and the evening proceeded. Under the table, very briefly, Rosalind's hand found mine, warm and still. I held it for a moment. Then we both released and sat composedly side by side and ate our dinner and talked to our guests, and the evening was, all things considered, fine. This is the moment I remember most precisely from all of it. Not the letter from Lord Vane in October. Not the arrival in the bad hired coach. Not the Thucydides, though I keep that with great clarity. Not even the morning in my study. But that moment, the table adjusting, the Countess swallowing her remark with the grace of long practice, the soup arriving at exactly the right moment as it always does, and her hand finding mine under the white linen without drama or display, simply warm and there. Lord Vane received my letter on the 12th of December and replied on the 14th. He gave his blessing in the particular style of a man who is giving something he had not expected to give and wishes it to be noted that he is giving it graciously. I noted it, and noted also that the graciousness was not warm. Rosalind had asked me to seek the blessing not because she required it, but because she understood that the relationship with her father-in-law was complicated in ways that would outlast this moment, and she preferred to have it than not. This was exactly the kind of practical wisdom she brought to things that reminded me, every time, that she saw further than I did in certain directions. The announcement at the New Year gathering was a somewhat larger affair, county-wide, as tradition held, which meant a drawing room full of the people most likely to have the strongest views, and who had therefore the most adjusting to do. I had never particularly enjoyed the New Year gathering. I found, standing at the entrance to the drawing room with Rosalind beside me. She wore a gown of deep winter-water blue, not turned or altered, entirely her own, that I enjoyed it considerably more than I had expected. She was talking to Lady Hargreave about the state of the county roads, and whether the Earl of Harton's position on the committee was sustainable given the current state of the Harton Bridge approaches, with the exact same directness she had brought to the subject at dinner on her first evening at Carrowmere. And Lady Hargreave was listening with the expression of someone who is being informed of something they had not considered, and finds that they appreciate being informed. The Countess of Wendellmore was gracious. This required something of her. I knew it required something, and I respected her for producing it. The county adjusted as the county does, slowly in some quarters, with surprising warmth in others, but it adjusted. The week after the gathering was the quietest and the most particular week I remember from that winter. The guests were gone. The house settled back into itself the way water settles after something has been dropped into it, finding its level again. Mrs. Pemberton put the great dining room back to rights, and the fires in the guest rooms were let down to their maintenance level, and the Elm Avenue outside was empty of carriages, and the moor was simply the moor under its January gray sky. And Rosalind was in the library with the 3rd Duke's Thucydides, exactly where she had been at 6 in the morning on the 12th of October, except that everything was different. I came in on the morning of the 10th of December with no pretense of needing a reference text. I simply came in and sat in the reading chair beside the window with the estate accounts I had not managed to concentrate on for 3 weeks, and she looked up from the Thucydides and then looked back at it, and we sat in the same room in the good winter quiet, working, for most of the morning. At 11, Mrs. Pemberton sent up coffee, and we had it by the fire and talked about the 3rd Duke's treatise, and whether the Historical Society in York or the one in Edinburgh was more likely to give it the reception it deserved. She favored Edinburgh, on the grounds that the Edinburgh Society had a stronger tradition of taking military history seriously, and the Marlborough passages in the treatise were its strongest claim to attention. I thought she was right. I said so. At a certain point, I put down my coffee cup and looked at the fire and said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "For October," I said, "for not coming out to receive you when you arrived. It was deliberate and it was wrong, and I would not have done it had I thought about it for 5 minutes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was not surprised. Lord Vane's description of the arrangement was not designed to make me feel like a guest." "No," I said, "but I was not Lord Vane. I made my own choice about how to receive you, and I made it carelessly because I had decided in advance who you were going to be and it required no particular consideration." I paused. "You were not who I had decided." "Who had you decided?" she said, not with any edge in it, simply curious. "Adequate," I said. "Competent and quiet and without inconvenient opinions. Someone who would be invisible in the house and solve the library problem and be gone in the spring. Someone who would not matter." A brief silence. "I am sorry," I said. She looked at me with those gray eyes for a long moment. "It was 7 weeks ago," she said. "I know. You changed your mind." "I did," I said, "fairly quickly and not without some difficulty since I do not generally change my mind. But yes." Another silence, and then that small corner-of-the-mouth thing happened, and she said, "Good morning, then, properly." "Good morning," I said, "properly." We were married in February in the estate church. Stone walls and candlelight and the smell of cold air and old hymn books, and the particular February light off the moor that is silver and clear, and belongs entirely to this latitude, to mornings like this one. The third Duke's Thucydides was in the library where it belonged. The 37 letters were in a cedar box on my desk, kept with the care that things deserve when they have waited a very long time to be acknowledged. We had not rehidden them. That seemed wrong, to put them back in the surveys, to make the same choice the third Duke had made. What he had hidden for 140 years deserved at least to be out in the open in the house where it had always lived. I have been asked since what it was. What changed a man who had spent 6 years perfecting his solitude and persuading himself that solitude was sufficient? I find I cannot answer this fully. The full answer requires saying things about what loneliness does to a person over a long time, how it becomes invisible, how it wears its own shape so that you stop being able to see it, that I still do not know how to say in company. I do not know how to say most things I feel most strongly. It is one of the things she has been very patient about. But the short answer is this. She came to discharge a debt that was not truly hers, in a situation she had not chosen and could not easily refuse, and she did it with such complete, unperforming dignity that it made everything I had built around myself look, very clearly, like what it was not sufficiency, but avoidance. The cold I had cultivated was not peace. It was the absence of something I had decided I was better off without, because I had managed to convince myself that wanting it was a weakness. It is not a weakness. I know this now. It took 39 years and a woman on a library ladder reading Greek to a cold northern house, but I know it. She had not tried to change me. She had not managed or maneuvered or worked toward my good opinion. She had simply been entirely herself in my house, reading Greek on a library ladder, arguing about niches and the eclipse at the Asinaris opening letters from 1751 with the careful hands of someone who understood that what was inside them mattered, saying what she thought and nothing more and nothing less. And I had found, watching her, that I wanted to be in a house where she was. Permanently. For as long as houses stood. "Leave the Greek to Oxford men," I had told her, in my large and specific foolishness, on a morning when she was already making the better catalogue of my library that anyone had managed in 40 years. I had said it with the unexamined confidence of a man who does not yet know he is wrong about the thing he is most confident about. By Christmas she had my study and my library and my name. And she had, though I had not known until she arrived, that it had been waiting there the whole time, kept in the dark the way the third Duke kept his letters in the estate surveys, my entire and ungovernable heart. The third Duke's letters are still in the cedar box. I read them sometimes in the evenings when the moor is black outside and the fire is good and the house is quiet. He was a man who chose what the world required of him and kept that choice faithfully and died with the other life entire and private. I do not judge him. He was formed by the world that made him, and he made the choice that formation allowed, and you can say the choice was wrong without faulting the man who made it. But I made a different one. And on the mornings when the winter light comes off the moor in that particular northern way and the elms stand in their bare December silhouettes against the pale sky, and Rosalind is in the library with the third Duke's Thucydides, reading it through now, she says properly as a whole, the way it was meant to be read, not just the annotated passages, and she reports on it at dinner with the serious pleasure of someone doing work they love. I know, without any doubt at all, that the different choice was the only one worth making, the only one in the end that was truly mine. The debt has been paid, the library is catalogued. The third Duke's treatise is in the hands of the Historical Society, where it has caused considerable interest and will cause more. The estate surveys of 1751 to 1756 are where they belong, tidily organized, as everything in this house now is, by both date and subject, so you can find what you need from either direction. What remains is the rest. The mornings and the evenings, the arguments and the quiet, the fire built up early before 6 because there are candles needed in the library, the moor in every weather, and the long life of a house that has decided, after more than 30 years of cold, to be warm at last. I find this suits me considerably better than I expected. I find it suits me entirely.